We're going to be doing a tubular bind off, which is a stretchy bind off for a 1x1 ribbing. I've already done it on the cuffs here. It's nice and stretchy, and it creates this nice sort of rolled edge. Doesn't flare out, lays pretty flat, and it's great for the bottom of sleeves or the end of your sweater. Now this is meant for a 1x1 rib. If you do have a 2x2 rib, you can rearrange your stitches into a 1x1 pattern and still use this bind off. For this bind off, there are 2 setup rounds before you get to the actual bind off. The first setup round is going to be to knit all of your knit stitches. And for your purl stitches, you're going to slip the yarn to the front of your work, pass that stitch purlwise from one needle to the other, and then move your yarn to the back of the work to do your other knit stitch. Keep going all the way around like that. If you're working a piece flat back and forth, your second setup round is going to be exactly the same as your first setup round. If you're working in the round, the second setup round is going to be the exact opposite. So you're going to slip your knit stitches with the yarn in the back of the work, then move your yarn to the front of the work to work the purl stitch. You don't have to work these 2 setup rounds, but they do make the edge a little bit more rounded and a little bit puffier. And if you really wanted a thick edge, you could actually work an additional 2 rows like this. Together, those 2 rows are gonna equal about 1 row of ribbing. So you're gonna wanna stop your regular ribbing about 1 row short of where you wanna be at the end. The tubular bind off, it is a sewn bind off. That means you are gonna cut your end yarn. You want it to be about 4 times the length of your finished piece, and you're gonna thread it onto a tapestry needle. That tapestry needle is going to move through each stitch twice. The first time is going to be to prepare the stitch. The second time will be to remove the stitch from the needle. If you're working in the round, the first 2 stitches at the beginning, you're only going to pass the needle through once. But when you come all the way back to the very end, you are going to pass the needle through the second time. So I've just put these 2 locking stitch markers onto those first 2 stitches so that we can find them again when we get back. Now the tubular bind off is essentially Kitchener stitch, and you're essentially going to be grafting the knit stitches to the purl stitches. If you have 2 spare needles that are, the same size you've been using or a size smaller, you can rearrange your stitches and move all your knit stitches onto the front needle, all the purl stitches onto the back needle, and just Kitchener them together. I'm going to show you how to do this without taking your stitches off of the needle. So you're going to take your tapestry needle. Now, how we remove these first 2 stitches is going to be a little bit different than when we get into the pattern for the rest of the stitches. So for the first stitch here, you're going to take your tapestry needle, you're going to put it into the stitch as if to knit. You're going to pull it all the way through. Now, just as when you're doing Kitchener stitch, you are essentially creating a row of stitches in between the knit stitches and the purl stitches. So you don't want to pull it completely tight. You want to leave a little bit of space. And we're going to remove this stitch from the needle. Now, we're going to skip the next stitch on the needle, which is a purl stitch, and we're going to go to the knit stitch. And we're going to take our tapestry needle, and we're going to go into that stitch as if to purl, and pull our yarn through. Just make sure you don't get too caught up in your locking stitch marker here. Next, we're going to go back to the purl stitch. Now this is the first purl stitch of our round. And we're going to take our tapestry needle and move it through that stitch as if to purl. Pull all the way through. We're then going to remove this stitch from the needle. We're going to skip the next stitch on our needle, which is a knit stitch, and we're actually going to take our yarn behind the needle. You're going to go all the way behind and in between the knit stitch and the purl stitch, and pull the yarn through to the front of your work. You're going to go over to the second stitch on your needle, which is a purl stitch, and you're going to go into this stitch as if to knit and put your tapestry needle out the back of your work behind your needle. Pull it all the way through. So now that we've got our first 2 stitches off the needle, we're going to get into the pattern that we're going to use around for the rest of the stitches. You're always going to work through 2 knit stitches and then 2 purl stitches. First stitch on your needle, you're going to go into as if to knit. And pull your yarn all the way through. You're then going to remove that stitch from your needle. Go to the next knit stitch on your needle. Go into that stitch as if to purl. And pull your yarn all the way through. The next stitch on your needle is a purl stitch. We're going to go into that stitch as if to purl. Pull your yarn through, then remove that stitch from the needle. Now you're going to take your yarn behind your work, take your tapestry needle, move it from back to front in between the knit stitch and the purl stitch. You're going to go over to the purl stitch, and you're going to put your tapestry needle through that stitch as if you're going to knit it all the way out the back of your work. And now you can get into a rhythm where for the knit stitch, go into the stitch as if to knit, pull your yarn all the way through, remove the stitch from your needle, go to the next knit stitch as if to purl, pull your yarn all the way through. Now go to the purl stitch, in as if to purl, pull your yarn through, and remove that stitch from your needle. Move your yarn behind your work. From back to front, you're going to come in between the knit stitch and the purl stitch. And then you're going to go into the purl stitch as if you were going to knit. And pull your yarn back through. Now you can start to do some of this in one motion, where you go into the knit stitch as if to knit, remove it from the needle, and then pull your yarn all the way through. Move to the next knit stitch, go into that stitch as if to purl. Go up to the purl stitch, go into it as if to purl, remove it from the needle, and pull your yarn all the way through. When you go to the next purl stitch, you can bring your tapestry needle behind your work from back to front, and then actually catch this purl stitch as if you were going to knit it. Kind of crosses the stitches a little bit, but that way you don't have to pull the yarn all the way to the front of your work just to pull it all the way back. And what you'll start to notice here is that you're getting this little line of yarn going back and forth that's going to create this nice rolled edge. And so you can just keep working all the way around until you come to the last few stitches. We're getting down to our last few stitches here. So for the knit stitch closest to the needle, we're gonna go into it as if to knit, remove it from the needle, skip to the next knit stitch, go into it as if to purl, and pull the yarn through. Now, if you're gonna do both stitches at the same time like that, it is gonna pull your tension a little bit tight. So after that pair, just pull on the bind off, make sure it's still stretchy for you. Now for the purl stitch, we're gonna go into it as if to purl, remove it from the needle. We're gonna go behind our work, push our tapestry needle from back to front, go to the next purl stitch on the needle, and go into it as if to knit, and out the back of our work. Pull through, tug on our bind off just to make sure it's still nice and loose. Gonna go into our knit stitch as if to knit, remove it from the needle, go into the next knit stitch as if to purl, and pull through. Go to the purl stitch on the needle, go into it as if to purl, remove it from the needle, go from back to front between the knit stitch and the purl stitch, go into the purl stitch as if you were going to knit, pull the yarn through the back. We're going to do that pattern one more time with our knit stitches, then with our purl stitches. So now we have 2 stitches left on our needle, and we've come around to where we have the stitch markers for the 2 stitches that we started off with in the beginning that we've only passed the tapestry needle through one time. So for our last knit stitch on the needle, we're going to go into it as if to knit and remove it from the needle. Then we're going to go to our first stitch marker here, which holds on to our very first knit stitch back from the beginning. And we're going to go through that stitch as if to knit, or sorry, as if to purl, and pull through. Now we're going to go to our final purl stitch on the needle. We go into it as if to purl, remove it from the needle. Then we're going to find, this is our first purl stitch, and it is behind our work that we want to catch it from. So we're going to figure out where this locking stitch marker is behind the work. And we're going to grab that stitch as if to knit and pull all the way through. And this just helps to pull all of our stitches together so that we don't end up with a big seam between where we started and where we finished. Now we can remove our stitch markers. And our bind off is all done, and we'll be ready to weave in this end and cut our yarn.